For 3 months, the house never slept. Even at 2 in the morning, when the rest of the city softened into distant traffic and a few blinking lights, the nursery was an ocean of noise, a high, keening tide that punched the ribs of the mansion and left everyone breathless. Rafael Ferraz moved through that noise like a man learning a city he had never built. He had money the size of small countries, and a face lined by things money could not buy, a tiredness that had nothing to do with late nights or business, and everything to do with helplessness. He wore suits like armor, but armor did not hush a baby's scream. On the sofa in the nursery, Renata Silva worked with the animals of sleep and hunger. She was 30, small-boned, with hands that seemed to know what to do before the mind remembered. She had been hired as a housekeeper and caregiver 2 months before, recommended by Sueli, the head house manager of 20 years. Renata moved through the room with a quiet fluency, the soft press of a palm against a cheek, the tilt of a cradle, the way she hummed a note beneath her breath, as if she were rewinding the air until it obeyed. The girls hated music then, and most people's hands. They were 2-month-old and miraculous in all the ways that come with new life, and they were unkind to everyone. They would not sleep, they would not settle, they would burn through bottles, spit and catch and keep crying. And the central fact of their early months became this: they had lived 3 months without a smile. Renata had been through a different kind of silence. She had a memory that sat behind her ribs like a stone, a hospital corridor, white and humming, a man who loved her and the way his fingers traced her palm like a question mark, a child who did not take a breath the way children should. The memory did not help her sleep. It made her soft in places where tenderness was sharpest. She had come to be with these children not because anger or need drove her, but because something in her refused to leave another baby's cry unanswered. When she took the twins, they changed, not all at once, not as if some magic fell. Rather, warmth radiated from her like a small current. She learned how to carry 2 without dropping the breath of either. She learned that one liked the rhythm of a rocking chair, and the other liked the quiet scrape of a thumb along a palm. She learned their small complaints and how to answer them. That first night that mattered, the night the title of 1,000 future articles would find its first spark, she sat with them on Rafael's knees. The house was exhausted. Even the chandeliers seemed to be holding their light as if that kept the crying at bay. Renata hummed. She tilted one baby and then the other, finding small places that needed soft pressure, and as she did, the cries thinned into tiny hiccups. She smelled milk and lavender and a faint metallic tang that always seemed to hang around people who had been up too long. Rafael watched, hands clasped as if in prayer. He did not always believe in miracles, but he believed in the person in front of him. He felt something he had not allowed himself. Lightness, a small, impossible lightness. For a man whose world was built on control, who made and unmade deals in boardrooms, watching these 2 small faces unclench was the closest he'd come to surrender and relief. Then Noah Hale, the head of security, stepped into the door. He had been hired the week the twins were born, a lean ex-Marine with movement like a shadow and a face that stopped polite conversation without meaning to. He rarely spoke unless necessary. He kept coffee in thermoses and wore the same black coat as armor against the world's unpredictabilities. He had been assigned as part of Rafael's private protection detail, a man whose job had always been to block things before they reached the family. That night he crossed the nursery and leaned against the doorway as if the sound could not touch him through that small distance. Noah had watched Renata work before, but had never intervened. He preferred to be seen and not to appear, a silent frame in the family's portrait. He had been present at births and birthdays and late-night calls that came at impossible hours. He knew that the problems of the world sometimes lived inside the home rather than outside it. He had seen men try to bargain with tears. He had seen women who smiled like survival techniques. He was not given to sentiment, but he was given to facts. On the day the girls smiled, Renata put both babies on Rafael's chest and smiled to herself, a small, private thing that acknowledged how close grief and hope lived to each other. They quieted, but their faces were still set with that serious confusion that babies carry when the world is too loud. Rafael kissed Renata's forehead in a gesture that said thank you, and perhaps I owe you. Noah stepped forward a single pace. He did something small and ineffable. He picked up a knitted rabbit from the rocker, sat on the floor, and made a little wind with his breath and the rabbit's floppy ears. He made a sound, a half squeak that was ridiculous and honest. The larger of the twins turned her head, eyes wide and liquid, and for the first time since birth, the corners of her mouth lifted. It wasn't a full grin, but it was a punishment of gravity, a real smile, the kind that rearranges a room. Rafael's shoulders fell. Someone in the house let out a sound that meant they had been holding it in for months. The other twin's face went soft in sympathy. She too spread something small it could be called a smile. The meaning of it was simple and vast at once. Two little human beings had responded to a human face that was not theirs, with the smallest acceptance of life. Renata's hands stayed where they were, resting lightly. She did not take credit. She would never have claimed it. But she watched Noah's motion the way someone watches water find its level.
Something in her recognized that the world had folded for a moment. The mansion exhaled. In the corner, unseen by most, Dr. Kasia Drummond watched. She had been the twins' private pediatrician since before they were born. She had been in the delivery room with a calm professional hand. She knew the babies' charts and their bloodlines. She knew which vaccinations had been given and which weeks of sleep training the family had attempted. On paper, her relationship with the family was clinical and warm. In private, she was a presence that expected to be indispensable. Kasia's face folded in a way that could be misread by those who did not know her as merely concentration. It was not concentration. It was a shading of control. She watched Noah, and she watched the baby's smiles. Something that was not clinical tightened in her chest. The look she gave Renata afterwards was small and precise, an observation layered with something else, like a hand hiding an object. Nobody saw the quick flex of her fingers when she took the baby's feed bottle from the tray and set it down again. Nobody saw the slow way she smoothed the cap and checked its seal. She was careful. Her hands were trained for precision. She had always been precise. She had always been necessary. That small smile would later be printed in headlines with 100 different verbs, but on that night it existed simply as a swell of human relief, a tiny fault line where something beautiful slipped through. It also existed as a trigger, a small pressure that would turn a wheel nobody expected. Renata went home that night by the back stairs, because the front doors were never really for her. The mansion in its grandeur made people unwieldy. Servants took different doors. Rain had started and the night smelled of ozone. Her apartment was small but clean. It held her few belongings and a photograph that kept her awake when the house was quiet. She lived alone with the memory she had carried for years. In her kitchen a kettle sang. She made tea and sat with the cup cupped in both hands. The silence of her apartment was a different tonic. It was private and soft. Her fingers worried at the band of a ring she kept on the table. She would touch it sometimes and feel how brittle hope could be. She thought of the babies and the small ripple that had come from Noah's rabbit. She thought quietly, not for show, that the world had been kinder for a moment. That thought was a small courage. She told herself she would not let the future be shaped by the past in any way that justified doing anything other than love her charges. 2 days later, Renata woke to a note from Sueli pinned to the kitchen door. Sueli's handwriting was round and unhurried. The note asked her to come early. Rafael wanted to speak with her about something. Renata polished her shoes because if you are taken in front of a man like Rafael, you want to at least look unruffled. Rafael's study smelled of old paper and cologne.
He took the conversation slowly. He asked her to tell him about the first week she had been in the nursery, about the ways she soothed the babies. He listened when she spoke of the music and the soft rocking. He didn't look accusatory. He looked like a man who wanted to understand how a thing that should be simple could be simultaneously complex. "You did something," he said finally, pointing to the small rabbit on the table, though not looking at it. "The girls responded. The nurses mentioned it. I wanted to thank you." Renata felt a color rise to her cheeks. The house could be a strange place for gratitude. She'd been given thanks in ways that left her apologetic, as if she owed something back for kindness. "I do what I can," she said. "I do what they need." Rafael's eyes were soft in a way that made her unsettled. He looked tired of being the man who could command any comfort and fail at this. "There are rumors," he said then, and the word opened like a trapdoor. About medication schedules, about a bottle that was off. I don't know what to believe." Renata's hands went cold. The way Rafael said it made it clear that somebody else had filled his ears. He watched her face as if seeking truth. Outside, behind the study curtains, the world continued its small, indifferent orbit. Inside, there was the stark sensation of being under scrutiny. Renata told him simply that she had never touched any medication. She had never had reason. She had been hired to care for the babies, not to administer medicine. She explained how she worked around the clock, how she held them. She told him, in the way people who have lost a child tell it's their own truth, that she knew what she was doing. Rafael sighed and promised to look into things. He left the conversation with gestures that meant on paper that he believed her. He went back to his meetings and quotas, and a life that had never been made to wait on small human certainties. He called the head nurse, made inquiries, and did what billionaires do: he moved resources. He assigned his team to verify medication logs. He did not yet know to ask the right questions. In the hierarchy of the house, there were objects that moved without notice: a nurse's clipboard, a sealed bottle, the little blue cap that fit on a particular syringe. To a man like Rafael, these objects were small components of a system that could be fixed. He wanted to fix the sound. Sueli, who had been with the family through reasonable and unreasonable things, watched Renata with a warm wariness. Sueli had lived long enough to know that people like Renata were often subject to suspicion because they were inside what others could not reach. Her notebook was small and worn. She recorded things other people missed: who had been in the nursery at dusk, what time the delivery man had come with a package, when bottles were refilled. Her writing was neat and defensive, and she made notes because it costs nothing to be careful.
The first sign that something was wrong was not a dramatic seizure or a headline. It was detail: a bottle cap with a slight scratch, a feed bottle that had been set backwards on the tray, a small smudge of powder that might have been flour if you looked at it with kindness. Sueli saw these and circled the dates. She was old enough to keep calendars like prayer books. Meanwhile, Dr. Cassia's actions became quieter and more precise. She began arriving earlier and leaving later. She supervised feeds where she had no clinical reason to do so. She adjusted the doses on the charts and left notes in a script that seemed to belong more to caution than to anxiety. There were moments she would pick up the feed bottle in the nursery, remove the cap, check the liquid as if counting pennies in a closed palm, then replace it with a sigh. Those close-ups, her fingers, the glint of the cap, would be replayed later, in far harsher lights. Renata had the perfect vulnerability. She was kind and low-profile, interested in tiny details, open about her past. That letter of vulnerability would make her beloved by the house staff and loathed by invisible others. She had told Sueli once about the baby she lost, about how the small thing had been bright for a day and then gone. She had told Sueli because secrecy felt like hoarding, and Sueli had folded that story into a shawl of protection. But stories, even quiet ones, are listenable. They make people guess motives. Rumors are not always started by malice. Sometimes they are carelessness, a phrase on a phone call that shifts like a thread through curtains. A nurse who had been dismissed months prior came in asking for references. She saw Renata carry a bottle past the nursery and thought nothing of it. Later, she would remember the way the bottle's cap sat odd and repeat it at a party. Words travel faster than truth. Finally, the night that broke something clean and new, the house was taut with a nervous energy. One child who had been circled by monitors all night began to spike in temperature. A nurse called the alarms, and Rafael came bounding down the marble stairs in a robe. The other staff filled the corridor like a small fide. Renata, who had been asleep in the small room attached to the nursery, arrived breathless. Her hands were steady because fear doesn't allow them to be otherwise. At the hospital, technicians moved like a brief symphony. Monitors flared. The child convulsed once, bilirubin spiking and muscles folding. By the book, the signs pointed to stimulant exposure. The way the baby was hot and agitated, the way normal sleep patterns had been replaced by a frantic, termite-like energy. Dr. Martins, a hospital pediatric neurologist with a blunt bedside manner, wrote the tasks out and requested a toxicology screen in urgent terms. He had seen the presentations before, and he did not waste sentences. When samples came back, the lab called. There was a trace of amphetamine in the child's blood.
It was a clinical phrase with a cold impact. The way news travels in the modern world is not kind to gentle reputations. Inside the house, chaos trickled into accusation. Someone found a small plastic bag with tablets in Renata's locker. The bag had been taped shut and placed in a place where a head of household would likely find it. The house had a hierarchy of trust that could be weaponized by placement. This was how people framed one another in rooms where class and power met like antagonists. Renata knew nothing of this until the knock came that would change the course of the next days. The knock came in the early morning, before the sun had finished its reach into sky. Men in plain clothes filled the entry hall like a practical earthquake. Policemen moved with a certainty that is designed to make compliance look like the clearest option. Paperwork was waved. Rafael stood at the edge like a man watching his life split into versions. "You're detaining me?" Renata asked. The words came out soft and tremulous. They were the kind of human sound that could not be faked. The officer spoke in crisp phrases about suspicion and possession. He mentioned the tablets and the complaint of a nurse who had seen Renata near medication the day before. He did not mention the scratch on the cap or the notebook entries or the odd pass of Cassia's finger. Those details belonged to the house. They were not part of the paper the officers held. Rafael's face moved in that small, private way of a man who was trying to reconcile faith with evidence. He had been given a set of facts, a lab report, a bag, and a locker. He had been told through channels that someone inside had betrayed them. He wanted to believe Renata. He wanted to refuse the simple arithmetic of suspicion. He gave a statement that ratified the officer's authority, but put his trust like a small, wavering flag behind him. He would cooperate. He would let law do its work. Renata was handcuffed with a gentle care they reserve for people they think will fit into the system. Sueli hovered, helpless, like a woman who is owed more time than she had to gather words. She touched Renata's arm and mouthed, "I know, I know." Her notebook was placed in the desk drawer like an offering she could not yet make. As they led Renata out past the nursery, she saw the twins through the frosted glass, their faces small and washed in nursery light. One of them turned her head and made a noise like a question. The other's cheeks flushed the way they always did when they were about to cry. They did not smile. Noah did something then, and it was the first of his public acts in this story. He stepped forward without instruction. He held out his hand in a still, official way and asked, "Can I carry them?" His voice did not rise. It was the voice of a man who was offered the urgent. He asked the question to Rafael and to the nurse all at once. There was a tiny electric hesitation.
The nurse glanced at protocol, and then at Rafael. She looked at the monitor and decided the babies might be calmer in arms than alone. Noah took the twins with a practiced gentleness that surprised even those who knew him. He settled them against his chest, and they went quiet, as if his uniform hemmed the world down. He rocked, slowly. He did not talk. He did not make a joke or a show. He breathed like someone who had been given a charge to watch the world, and kept watch. In that hold, one of the twins tipped her head to him and blinked. She looked at his face, and then did something that had not been recorded for weeks. She smiled. It was small and accidental, like a sunrise that edges the horizon. For a second, the nursery light shifted. The cameras in the house picked it up. The nurses took a breath that had been caught somewhere in their chests and released it with a sound that was nearly a sob. The head nurse, who had been looking at charts and blotting out possibility with professional distance, laughed, short and raw. Noah's arms moved in a motion so ordinary it might have been nothing. He had done something mundane, held them and breathed. But mundanity reshaped lives, and in this house, the smallest gestures carried the weight of fate. Later, when a photograph of that smile traveled through the threads of the household, a still taken from a nurse's phone, the image would be described as a small miracle. Later, people would say the bodyguard saved them in that moment. But at the time, it was only a comfort. 2 babies recognized a human face and responded. For Renata, who had lost so much, the sight of it cut and healed in the same motion. She had been the one to soothe them before. Now someone else had made them smile. That smile circulated like a coin. It bought envy as easily as joy. For Cassia, who had been watching that room for months like an owner of a fragile instrument, it was a threat encoded as triviality. If the family could be soothed by a bodyguard's rabbit or the tilt of a stranger's head, then the doctor's place in the constellation might fade. She had arranged her life to be necessary. She had built hours into positions where her absence would create discomfort. To Cassia, necessity was not merely professional, it was acutely personal. It had weight. After the arrest, the household split along lines that were both obvious and invisible. The staff moved with the economy of survivors. Some chose to close ranks, a few flirted with rumor, as one does to pass the time. Sueli closed her notebook and tried to think in terms of facts. The head nurse, who had been the one to find the tablets, clutched her clipboard with an expression that suggested she had done her duty. Dr. Martins at the hospital called with terse updates that made Rafael's jaw tighten. Noah, meanwhile, did an unusual thing. He went into the nursery alone and took the small rabbit from the rocker. He sat on the floor and arranged the 2 babies across his knees. The photograph of him with the twins would later be framed in a dozen private albums. He hummed a note he had not used in front of anyone. The babies sighed and closed their eyes. But the thing Noah did best was invisible. He watched. He watched the way the house moved, the tiny rearrangements of objects, the way a cap would be twisted on and off like an absent-minded punctuation. He watched Cassia's face with a hawk's patience. He kept his own counsel because that was how a man in his job survived. He had been paid to do a job that found its completion when danger never reached the family. Now danger had reached the family from within. He kept the rabbit, and he kept the image of the girl's smile in his phone. He also, without telling anyone, photographed the feed bottles. He took a small collection of images, one of a cap with a slight scratch, one of a feed bottle that had residue in a place where residue did not belong, one of a small packet under the sink. He placed these images in a locked folder and closed it like a safe. He was not sure what he would do with these pictures, but he understood that when an institution gave you the grammar of protection, your first instinct becomes to gather grammar. Renata was booked in the station under charges of possession and culpable negligence. She signed forms with an expression of someone who understood how forms could be both protection and condemnation. Sueli stayed to watch her go to the car. She put her notebook in a safe place and whispered a vow into the space between pages. "I will remember everything." The press arrived before the sun found the nursery. Cameras set up on the gate of the mansion like ugly flowers. Reporters circled for quotes. "Caretaker arrested in infant poisoning case," read one headline that would later be retracted in part. "Millionaire's house in shock." People love a scandal that has tidy villains. It fit the hunger to see justice served quickly and with clean lines. Nobody yet understood the thin, precise instrument of sabotage that had been prepared with the skill of a surgeon. Rafael watched the cameras and felt something like guilt that would not be satisfied by statements. He released a short public note because his life required that he do so. It was a note of sorrow and procedural cooperation, the kind of blandly official thing that is meant to function like a shield. In the privacy of his study, he dialed names and summoned actions. He also, with an intimacy he seldom gave in public, closed his hands around Noah's wrist and asked him not only to stay but to watch over things with a particular care. He did not say keep the baby safe. He said protect the truth. When the car that carried Renata drove away, a small wind pushed through the hedges and turned to roses white. The nursery was quiet, as if someone had muted a radio.
The two little faces looked out through the frosted glass, and for the first time in days, neither smiled. They had been held by 1,000 hands and soothed by many techniques, but the narrative that would form around this night insisted on a simple villain and a simple victim. Renata was taken away before the mechanics of the story had time to be examined. Noah locked the nursery door behind him and kept watch. He made his rounds and left notes in Lewis, the nurse's log. He texted a number of people who answered with more concern than information. He was beginning to see a pattern in small things: the precision of Cassia's signatures on certain orders, the schedule changes that matched times when the girls were also restless. He did not yet have proof. He did not even have a hypothesis he could present in court. What he had was instinct and a file of images. Back at the station, Renata sat on a bench that scraped her knees and thought about a hospital corridor and how quiet it had been when she lost a child. She wondered for a terrible moment if fate had a shape at all, or whether it was just people making each other into stories. The officers shuffled papers and made room for a truth that could be simple and monstrous. A small thing happened in the sliver of time between her arrest and the first court hearing. Someone in the house, a cleaning woman, found a note tucked between the nursery curtains. The note was written in Sueli's hand and had one line underlined. It said simply, "Check caps, check surveillance." The person sent a picture of the note to a private number and added in a panicked text, "What does it mean?" That image moved like a silent enemy across the house's network. It landed on Noah's phone late that afternoon. He read it and understood that quiet acts must be built into louder ones if one hopes to find a truth. He had a folder of evidence and no stronger authority than his own job to act. He also had the twins' smiles in a photograph and something like a moral irritation that would not be soothed by a formal, slow process. He could feel, for reasons he could not yet name, that the case would not be solved by paper alone. When he returned to the nursery and set the rabbit back in its place, the room felt like a theater where actors had gone off stage and left properties still warm. The cameras in the house had been shut down for the day, for privacy, for legal reasons. The small scratched caps and the bottle with the residue would be described later in legal language. For now they sat like evidence in a quiet drawer. Noah thought about the smile and then thought about the bottle caps. He connected them with the ease of someone trained to see threat lines. It was impossible to ignore the coincidence of Cassia's increased presence and a small drift of residue on one of the bottle's threads. He was not a detective by trade. He was a man whose job was to notice angles and omit nothing. The house, which until that morning had seemed an egalitarian network of obligations and perks for those who lived in its glow, had become a machine that produced accusation and neat parts. The person inside, Renata, small and trembling, now sat in a cell and thought of the day she had first held a child that had not survived. She thought of the way Noah's face had looked at the rabbit and the way the two girls had smiled at him. Those memories were thin and vital, like the last thread holding an umbrella to the wind. If the smile had been the first domino, then the photograph of the tablet in her locker was the second. It appeared so neatly, so maliciously placed, that even the officers who read the reports felt a prickle of disbelief. People are complicated like that, sometimes suspicious of the easy answer, even as they accept it. For the people on the outside, watching on their phones and live feeds, two narratives now competed: the helpless girl from a poor neighborhood accused of poisoning the twins of a millionaire, and the private man who watched his family fragment into public spectacle. Both narratives were true in parts and false in others. The truth, like always, would be found in small items, in an old notebook, in a scratched cap, and a photograph that someone had the wit to take. Renata slept that night in a holding cell where the light never changed its mind. She lay awake thinking of the rabbit and the way it had made the babies reach a place of recognition. She thought of Sueli's hands and the way the older woman had pressed her palm to Renata's cheek before the men had taken her away. She thought about the woman she had once been, who had lost a child and learned that grief can teach you the specifics of tenderness. Noah, who had done something small and ordinary that had yielded a miracle, a smile, did something else that night. He moved through the house and collected the small things other people overlooked. He clipped images from the nursery feed. He took a picture of the scratch on the cap and another of Cassia's handwriting on a schedule. He slipped quietly into the server room and checked the footage from the day the tablet appeared and from the day the feed bottles were swapped. At 2:14 a.m., a camera showed Dr. Cassia entering the storage closet near the nursery. She moved with professional reasons. She had her keys. She opened a small cabinet and replaced two small items on the shelf. The camera showed her fingers linger on the bottle as if she were searching for the right fit. She closed the cabinet and left. The footage, a small sequence of hand and object, was nothing more than that. A hand and an object. For now, it was an ambiguous motion. Ambiguity would be the house's new climate. Noah did not publish the footage. He did not have the right to be so. He placed it in the folder and added the photos of the scratched cap and the feed bottle. He texted Sueli, "I am watching."
She replied with a single heart emoji and the words, "Be careful." When the camera footage was put in a locked server and the images archived, the house seemed to wait under a bell. People did not yet know whether the sound that had begun with a rabbit and a smile would turn into something that liberated an innocent woman or something that would tear the family into pieces. They only knew that, for now, Renata was arrested, and the twins' smiles had been captured by a man who had not meant for that act to start a war. Outside the station, protesters gathered on the fringe of a news crew's attention, holding signs that were as ambivalent as the world. Inside, in a room with a window that showed a sliver of sky, a man named Rafael signed the papers that would allow the investigation to move. He answered questions with a voice that was steady enough for press releases and jagged enough for private life. He promised transparency. The small things were aligning into lines that suggested culpability. The houses that made such moral claims, the papers, the cameras, the comment thread theologians, were building a scaffold that might either convict a real criminal or bury an innocent one. The bodyguard, who had started with a rabbit and a smile, kept a photograph in his pocket and a folder on his phone, and he moved through the house now like a man who understood that sometimes protection meant making choices that were not handsome. Renata slept badly. She dreamed of a white corridor and her lost child with hands like a fist. She woke with the sound of two small voices in her chest and hoped with a faith that felt like hunger that someone would see the truth. She was not, to the law that sat in pages and notches, an object of pity. She was a suspect. The world liked to make laws tidy. When they took her to the station, she had on the jacket Rafael had lent her once when the wind had been sharp. The jacket smelled faintly of his cologne. It felt like a talisman, and she kept it like one, as if faith could be sewn into fabric. In the booking room, a woman from social services asked quietly about her family. Renata told the truth. She had a mother named Marcia who lived in a small apartment 3 hours away. She had a distant sister and an uncle with a phone number she could reel out from memory. The woman in social services folded her hands and wrote what she was told. When the word got out about her arrest, the internet did the thing it always does. It spoke in absolutes. Profiles were made into monsters overnight. People supplied narratives out of hunger. Renata found herself the subject of 1,000,000 judgments made without context. And the world decided an answer for her before she could find one for herself. The feeds filled with shorthand judgments overnight.
1,000 strangers named her with a sharpness that belonged to people who did not know how to hold nuance. She was careless, she was dangerous, she was the kind of person who took what she wanted and left the rest of the life to rot. The comment sections were patient with outrage. The menus of cable news carved stories that fit neatly into a moral rectangle. Renata watched it all through a tiny window of a public computer at the police station. She read only the first line of the headlines, then closed them. It was easier to lose herself in how the lock felt cold against her wrist than to pretend the world had not already formed a verdict. In the mansion, the press pack camped on the avenue like an unpaid chorus. Cameras recorded servants arriving and leaving. The more urgent the journalists sounded, the more Rafael withdrew into a place where decision was both a responsibility and a wound. He made statements because statements are the currency a man in his position is expected to spend. He signed cooperation letters and hired lawyers who spoke in flat, strategic tones. He had given men like Noah an order to protect. Now he gave him the mandate to find truth wherever truth could be hidden. He meant it when he asked Noah to watch for the facts. He did not know, at the time he spoke those words, how literal the request would have to be. Sueli moved like a woman who had accepted that her role had changed from manager to archivist of memory. She unfurled pages from her worn notebook and sent photographs of circled dates to a private number Rafael trusted. She taped other pages to a clipboard and made herself small appointments: lunch with the hospital's head nurse, coffee with the cleaner who had found the note in the curtains, a whispered conversation at the gate with a delivery driver who remembered the shape of a small packet. Each call was slow and meticulous. Each exchange added a tile to a mosaic that had, until then, been grainy and malevolent. Noah did what he had been trained to do in a world where risk might be a stranger breaking a window or a letter threatening a life. He cataloged. He did not rush to publicize the footage he had archived. He knew people who had seen evidence and then regretted the hasty presentation of it. He put the camera files on an encrypted drive, named them with dates in a way only he understood, and then he did the thing he had avoided in the first moments of panic. He went to a legitimate authority outside the home. He brought the files to Inspector Duarte, a public prosecutor with an interest in domestic crimes and a quiet exhaustion that matched Rafael's. Duarte listened more than he spoke. He watched the footage: Cassia's hands, the cabinet, the shadow of emotion, on a screen in a small office that smelled faintly of coffee. He did not exclaim, he did not leap to conclusions. He asked questions: chain of custody for medication, access logs, who had keys, who could move the packages.
He wrote notes in a tight, authoritative hand. Noah handed Duarte a printed copy of Sueli's circled dates. He gave him the photo of the scratched cap and the images from Renata's rocker. He framed them in a narrative that was simple and economical. An internal actor could have been manipulating medication. The evidence was subtle, but it existed in patterns. He did not accuse with a flourish. He only offered the materials and watched as a legal system that moved slowly under the weight of solid reasons began to pivot. The first forensic test of the gay, the one that made the world refill its breath, was not dramatic in itself. Analysts examined a set of caps retrieved from the nursery cabinet. They swabbed threads for residue. When the lab called, the voice on the other end was trained to be procedural. It conveyed data with a voice that rarely carried feeling. The swabs contained a stimulant compound consistent with an amphetamine derivative. Not enough to be theatrical in description, but enough to be dangerous to a baby. That lab result triggered a procedural recalibration. An internal inquiry at the private clinic where Cassia worked now had cause to look beyond clinical curiosity and into intentional acts. Investigators examined prescription logs and compared the handwriting on notes with samples. They pulled CCTV from multiple angles, cross-referenced batch logs, and requested immediate sections of medical waste disposal ledgers. A pattern did not lie in a single moment. It lay across hours, signatures, and small, repeatable habits. Meanwhile, Renata sat in a county cell and kept her hands busy in the only way she knew how. She organized the thoughts in her head into a speech of truth she might give if ever given the chance. She repeated details to herself until they were less personal and more like tools. The time she had been in the nursery, the feed she had never prepared, the night she had stayed awake with the baby's cries. She had been careful in front of the staff. She had done nothing she was accused of. She told herself the sequence of events in the same measured voice she used to quiet infants. It helped. It kept panic from deforming into despair. Prisoners are a patient audience for stories of the outside world. An older woman in the cell with Renata had been reading newspapers for years and offered the counsel of fatalists and Christians alike. They'll try you fast when they can, she said, with the bluntness of someone who had watched many human narratives reduced to their minimal parts. Then they'll slow when their hands get cold. The woman tapped her chin and added, softer. Hold what you know. The hospital remained a separate weather system from the courtroom. The twins lay in a small cluster of beds behind glass where only people with permission could pass. Machines beeped with the even, mechanical empathy of lives supported by technology. Doctor?
Martins walked the unit with an energy that had the edges of both hope and deep boredom at the human propensity for drama. He reviewed charts and ordered another toxicology, more complete this time: hair samples, a sweep for metabolites, checks for traces in caretaker's blood. He was thorough because in his experience, the truth often hides in the things people assume are unimportant. When the comprehensive tox screen on the infants returned, it confirmed the first result. Amphetamine metabolites were present at levels consistent with repeated exposure. The language of the lab filled rooms like a formal dress, technical and dispassionate, but it carried weight. The discovery forced the investigation inward again. Whoever had access to medication or to the feed bottles was now under a new kind of scrutiny. The press were not idle. They stitched together narratives that kept their audiences fat with certainty. A morning show hosted a segment that leaned in the direction of the indictment. A tabloid published a reworked photograph of Renata that made her look smaller and guiltier than she felt. Rafael found his own face in these rotations and flinched. For a man used to power, the experience of public opinion was a private humiliation. He could arrange the instruments of business, but he had no control over how the world chose to interpret his family's pain. Noah and Sueli continued to work in tandem. Sueli's handwriting began to mean more in official circles than any casual witness's voice. She had a way of mapping the household so that the smallest items, like the day the feed bottle was found unscrewed, became part of a timeline that could not be dismissed as simple coincidence. She gave her notebook to Duarte under oath. She explained each circled date, each note with a voice that had been steady for decades. Her testimony, precise and unglamorous, pulled the investigation from suspicion to a set of verifiable leads. The breakthrough came, as so many truths do, from a place where two small coincidences lined up to make a pattern. A lab technologist noticed that the metabolite signature in the infant's blood matched, in part, with a pharmaceutical compound that Cassia had been known to carry for herself, an off-label stimulant she used to keep vigil on long nights. Cassia's locker at the clinic contained a small prescription vial. Its cap, when swabbed, returned traces that matched the ones found on the bottles. The chain of evidence required tightening. Who had access to her keys? How often did she bring medication to the home? Were there extra refills ordered? But the outlines were drawn. Confronted with the narrowing tape of evidence, the prosecution obtained a search warrant and looked in Cassia's locker at the mansion. There they found a set of pills hidden in a narrow box. Pills that, when tested, contained amphetamine analogs. The handwriting on a ledger matched the notes she had made in the baby's charts.
In a small pocket of a jacket they found, improbably, a torn corner of the same blue cap that matched one of the scratched pieces Noah had photographed weeks earlier. When the police took Cassia into custody for questioning, she entered the interview room with the precise calm of someone who had practiced being essential all her life. Her professional face was the same she used when delivering difficult news to parents. She leaned forward with the clinical devotion of someone used to being believed. It is possible in intellect to see every angle of a confession, the pressure, the moral collapse, the way denial sometimes dissolves into admission. Cassia did not confess at first. By then, the house had become a theater of quiet scenes. Renata saw, briefly, a photograph in a news clip of Cassia being led to a police car. The image had the geometry of irony. A doctor, who had been the family's steward of health, now bound in legal hands. Renata's world stayed small and occupied. She spent her hours composing statements, receiving visits from a lawyer whose sympathy felt professionally measured, and listening for word of the twins. The case moved into the public hearings phase with a slowness that annoyed people on both sides. The legal machine asks for documentation, for chain of custody demonstrations, for expert testimony that can translate residue into culpability. Duarte arranged for the lab tech to explain the metabolite distinctions. He summoned Dr. Martins to testify about the physiological signs of stimulant exposure. The courtroom became a place where technical language and human faces rubbed against each other until clarity emerged like a polished stone. The prosecutors presented a patient sequence. They showed the footage of Cassia accessing the storage closet and the time she had supervised the feeds. They placed Sueli's notebook on the desk for all to see, a grid of dates and times that matched instances of the baby's distress. They had the lab report that connected the residues in the bottles to substances in Cassia's locker. They had cell phone location data that placed her near the cabinet on dates of particular interest. The narrative was not dramatic in the way a movie might demand. It was the accumulation of steady, precise facts that made panic fall apart. When the prosecutor asked pointed questions about motive, the courtroom filled with a kind of hush. Motive, in the case of Cassia, did not have the simplicity of money. Her life in the family had been built on something more fragile, an identity as irreplaceable. She had structured hours, lists, calendars, and worried like a craftsman over their intersection. That obsession to be necessary turned inward when she perceived the threat of redundancy. Noah smiling at the babies with a rabbit had been a small fracture. The smiles that followed became, in her mind, a proof that her indispensability was dissolving. For a woman whose professional competence overlapped with personal needs, this was a wound. Cassia's defense lawyer argued the usual strategies: coincidence, a lab error, the possibility of contamination. He advanced alternatives: Renata's alleged access, the risk of tampering by unknown third parties. The lawyer's voice was precise and practiced. He suggested that a person's clinical demeanor did not determine guilt. He was not wrong in principle, but in the collection of small facts that Duarte and his team presented, the distance between doubt and reasonable suspicion shortened. Still, the human element in the courtroom could not be replaced by charts. A nurse who had worked with Cassia testified about late-night phone calls the doctor had made to the family, about the small possessive phrases she used when speaking of the twins. A colleague described her as intensely protective to an unhealthy degree. Those phrases, when strung together under oath, made a kind of portrait of someone for whom the line between care and possession was blurred. When police asked to see the surveillance footage in a clearer edit, an image surfaced that turned faces pale in the public gallery, a frame where Cassia reached into a box and, with no eyes on her, slipped a small object into her pocket. The sequence was short and unadorned, professionally filmed, clinically stark. It was the kind of thing that does not require theatricality to convey guilt. She had the tools to alter the life of the infants, and she had used them. Under the pressure of accumulating proof, certainly no deus ex machina, but a legal and medical cordon that closed, Cassia reached a point where denial became a living thing that required constant energy to maintain. The day the investigators presented the ledger handwriting match, the prescription log entries, and the metabolite signature to her, something in the carefully constructed architecture of her life collapsed. She did not confess on camera with a dramatic flourish. Instead, she sat in a room under bright fluorescent lights and said, in the voice she used to soothe others, "I thought I was protecting them." Her words were not a sudden beating of a guilty heart. They were the confession of someone whose need to be indispensable had been warped into a method. She spoke of late nights where she would not sleep for fear of missing an early sign. She admitted to introducing small doses in the feed in ways she rationalized as temporary adjustments, a phrase she told herself could be undone. She had not, she said, intended to hurt, but she had continued. She had rationalized. She had watched two small reactions, smiles, attention, and convinced herself the ends justified the means. In legal terms, her admission was complicated and not immediately equivalent to the end of prosecution.
Psychologists were called upon to explain the slide from professional care to dangerous obsession. Ethics panels were convened. Her colleagues backed away and recorded statements filled with the kind of stunned betrayal that makes careers look like houses of cards. When the police informed Renata that the primary suspect in her case had been taken into custody and that material evidence tied the doctor to the residues, she felt something like incredulous relief. The cell that had felt like a time capsule of accusation suddenly had a crack of light in one corner. But the world had not yet become kind. Arrest did not instantly erase papers or comments. Old headlines had been printed, and public memory is a slow-working thing. Renata was still officially charged until investigators could move through the arc of procedure. Even with new evidence, formal exoneration takes time. Noah, who had done the early, quiet work of preserving the footage, watched these moves with practical attention. He kept the photograph of the twins' smile in a folder he called for later. He had always thought that his role, while silent, could carry weight. Now that weight had a public momentum. He had been the bodyguard who, with small gestures, first made them smile. He had become the man who gathered the threads that hinted at a truth other people had not wanted to see. Public sentiment began to shift in increments. Columns that had printed op-eds condemning Renata started to run for actions. Media outlets, embarrassed by the haste of their narratives, softened their language. A morning host who had taken pleasure in a tidy villain publicly apologized. The apology had the flattened cadence of scripted regret, but it mattered to the people in the story. The arc of a scandal, in modern terms, is often a movement from accusation to retraction. Never elegant, always messy. The day the prosecutor dismissed the charges against Renata pending final forensic crosschecks, the news traveled like a slow-release tide. She received the message through her lawyer, an email, 2 lines, the official archive of the thing that had been clawing at her life. She read the lines 3 times before any feeling assembled. Then she cried with the startling singularity of someone who had been given back a thing that had been taken, but could not be fully restored. Time, reputation, the composure of being believed. Her release from custody was not an end so much as the beginning of a complicated, slow sequence of repair. Rafael came to meet her in the courtyard outside of the courthouse. He stood as he always did, tall, formal, yet his eyes had the lines of a man who had been humbled. He did not speak perfunctory phrases. He stepped forward and simply wrapped his arms around her. The embrace was not theatrical. It was exacting and real. In the weeks that followed, the household moved into a phase of restitution and reconnection that required patience and small acts. Rafael issued a public apology on behalf of his family. He posted a short statement that acknowledged the failure of his household to protect an innocent person. It was not a full undoing of the harm that had been done to Renata's reputation, but it was a public instrument of repair. A man with resources accepted responsibility in a way that could be measured with dollars and legal statements. But money could not buy back the days Renata had lost in a cell. She returned to a world where neighbors and colleagues would hold in their mouths an apology tasting faintly of shame. Some doors remained closed. She received messages from some former friends that were perfunctory in their solidarity. Others went silent. Her mother, Marcia, whom she had not seen in months, arrived at the gates of the mansion with shaky hands and an apology that was too late and yet entirely necessary. Marcia did not speak of the internet or the loudness of public judgment. She spoke of her daughter's face and how she had misjudged the world's cruelty for years. Sueli offered work that was modest and steady. Return to the nursery, watch the babies, keep a calendar. The household negotiated carefully. There would be legal settlements, offers of employment, and the slow accretion of trust. Rafael insisted that Renata be cleared to return to the nursery only after a schedule was set that gave her autonomy and oversight by neutral parties. She would no longer be an unprotected worker. She would be part of an arrangement that sought to respect her position and heal what had been broken. Healing in the house took small victories. Renata returned to the nursery and spent time relearning the rhythms of the children she had nearly been accused of harming. The twins did not smile on command. They were infants who responded to the small constellations of human touch. Renata learned to let them approach her. She demurred when people offered gratitude and learned, with a stubbornness that came from loss, to accept small thanks without turning it into an expectation. She found her place within a new framework where professionals were vetted differently and where security protocols had changed. Noah remained a constant. He continued to do his work without seeking credit. The family thanked him with quiet gestures, an extra day off granted, a more forgiving schedule, and with the photograph of the twins' early smiles printed and placed in the family album. He hung the picture in his locker only once the immediate risk had passed. He did not allow himself to dwell on the way publicity had painted him as the man who saved the children. He had done what his job asked: protected, gathered, presented. That for him was enough. Cassia's public unraveling was both swift and painfully ordinary. She lost her license. Her clinic shuttered the ward she had once run. At her trial, the expert testimony described a clinician who had blurred the line between attachment and possession.
The verdict, when it came, was not purely a moral exclamation. It was a legal reckoning. She was sentenced to prison for endangerment and medical malpractice, and the court ordered a restitution that was symbolic more than compensatory. No payment could entirely restore the lost months of Renata's life. After the legal bust settled, a media narrative attempted to shape the arc into a tidy story of villainy and redemption. But the people who had lived through the event felt something more complicated. Renata did not take to interviews. She declined offers for speaking engagements that promised to monetize her suffering. She wanted privacy and a life that allowed for small kindnesses, a pastry shared with a colleague, an afternoon nap without someone asking for a quote. She wanted to be recognized as a person who had cared, not as a character edited for the sake of an audience. Rafael, whose grief had animated his decisions, found himself drawn in ways he had not anticipated to a woman who had been both wounded and kind. He began to visit the nursery more often, not with the formal, distant interest of an employer, but with an attention that had a softness to it. He asked questions about schedule changes and the baby's preferences. He listened when Renata spoke of the small things that calmed the twins, the way the larger one liked the hum of a fan, how the smaller one favored the rhythm of a soft humming. He watched her in the way of a person who had watched a friend return from injury. Their relationship began as something slow and cautious. Neither rushed to name what stirred between them.
Noah carried them in a careful crook of arm and shoulder, a posture that belonged to a man who knew both how to hold a life and how to carry evidence with quiet hands. They walked beneath olive trees and loquat bushes. A breeze moved through the leaves, and the garden smelled faintly of citrus. A child on a stroller passed and smiled at the sight of the two little faces. One of the twins opened her mouth, and in an instant the curve of a small smile bloomed, as if the day itself were offering it. It was small, fragile, but it arrived like a pledge. People in the garden looked on with the relief of witnesses who had watched a trial unravel and then, slowly, mend. For Noah, it was an ordinary closure. For Renata, who watched from a nearby bench, It contained the long, slow arc of a vindication no headline could entirely map. She felt the sort of gratitude that is practical, more than loudly felt. She breathed in the cool air and let the moment be what it was, delicate, true. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. Recovery has the texture of a long seam, small stitches, repeated. Renata's reputation healed in uneven places. The family arranged for her to take an official position, no longer under the precarious title of a temporary caregiver, but as a recognized early childhood specialist within the household, with proper legal protections and a salary that made her comfortable. Rafael supported charitable initiatives in the community to examine how domestic workers are protected and how protocols could prevent internal crimes. He funded a training program and created a scholarship in his name and Renata's, an act that was less about absolution than about structural repair. The romance between Rafael and Renata, gentle and earned, continued its slow unfurling. They learned how to apologize and how to accept apologies. He learned how to check his power and ask consent. She learned how to trust someone with authority without assuming it would swallow her. They shared small rituals, an after-dinner walk, a coffee in the old sitting room, a day at the market among people whose lives had not been filtered through news cameras. Love, if that is what it became, was not sudden. It was the patient outcome of two people who had been alarmed into seeing each other as more than roles. On the day they decided to announce a formal partnership, they did it simply. There was no grand parade of symbols. They exchanged private vows in the house's small chapel, an intimate human act that acknowledged wounds and pledged to tend them. The wedding was not broadcast. People from the staff attended. Some of the guests had been skeptical once and now watched with the awkward joy of men and women who had seen suffering and wanted beauty to remain possible. Sueli stood at Renata's side, her notebook set aside for once, her face calm and proud. Noah stood near Rafael, the photograph of the twins' early smile tucked into his pocket.
The twins, now older and steadier, played under the benign watch of adults who had learned lessons about trust and control. Their smiles became part of ordinary days, a slice of toast dropped with laughter, a small game of peekaboo that made a room glitter. They were, more than anything, infants allowed to be children. Cassia's sentence served as a public reminder. The misuse of trust is a crime that wears a professional's coat, but the law, when applied with patient rigor, can untangle motives from method. She wrote letters from prison that were both contrite and self-analytic. They were not publicized. She asked for therapy, and the court ordered psychological treatment as part of her sentence. The tragedy for her was not merely punishment, but the loss of identity. In private, people continued to wonder about the moral edges of the story. Was Cassia merely obsessive, or was her crime a symptom of a larger institutional blind spot where professionals can fall into possessive patterns? Rafael, who had once thought his resources could fix anything, learned that protection requires the humility to consider small gestures, like a protector sitting with a rabbit, and to honor them without assuming they were unimportant. Noah continued his work, now recognized in a way he never wanted to be recognized, quietly and with a deep sense that the job he had accepted years before sometimes asked for more than watchfulness. Renata and Rafael did not escape the public's complicated affections. There were still curious strangers and those who wanted the finer details, but they also found friends who would stay outside the glare. They taught the twins how to swim in a pool that once had been merely a place for parties. They taught them how to accept a hug without reading it as a transaction. They taught them the language of carefulness, how to say sorry, how to set boundaries, and how to repair when one has been the cause of harm. Years later, when someone told the story in the kind of breathless paragraph the internet adores, the simplified headline would live in contrast to the slow, messy reality. The succinct version, "The Millionaire's twins didn't smile until the bodyguard did something that changed everything," had its own truth. Noah had done a small thing that became large. He had reached into the domestic noise and pulled out evidence. He had protected beyond the obvious physical threats and kept archives that, when needed, spoke with a clarity that rumor never could. He had, in tastefully ordinary ways, been the pivot of a story that might otherwise have been another cruelty to a vulnerable worker. But the real change, the part the headline could not measure, was the way a house rearranged itself afterward. Protocols were rewritten. Keys were logged. Medication audits became routine. Training programs for household staff included psychological safeguards and clearer lines of accountability.
Rafael created a fund to assist domestic workers who suffered public defamation. Sueli received a small pension and a public commendation for her role in preserving memory. These were administrative gestures, perhaps unromantic, but the kind that stitch a social fabric. On a quiet evening, years after the storm, Renata sat in the nursery with the twins, now older and more boisterous than any photograph could capture. One of them banged a wooden spoon and giggled at the rude, ordinary noise. She looked up at the ceiling,
and saw somewhere beyond the plaster the thin map of former troubles. She thought of the time she spent in a cell and of the way the world had accused her with speed and tenderness with stone-cold efficiency. She thought of Noah with his rabbit and his camera and the way small people in big houses sometimes perform heroic patience. She let the past exist without letting it claim her. Rafael entered without fanfare, carrying 2 cups of tea. He sat beside her, not with the intent to fix, but to be present. He reached for her hand, and they watched the children play. The house no longer felt like a place that would immediately punish a kindness with suspicion. It had become, imperfectly, a village that knew to check its locks and records and to listen before forming conclusions. When the twins laughed, their mouths open and their eyes bright, Renata smiled, not because she needed proof of anything, but because the shape of their joy had become part of her daily life. It was the slow work of reclamation, a life rebuilt with patient hands and careful watchfulness. She had been accused, nearly destroyed by rumor. She had been confirmed by evidence. She had been offered an apology, some public, some private, and she had accepted those that were real. In quiet moments, someone would point to the photo of Noah holding the twins for the first time, and they would call it the turning point. He had done a small, humane thing that carried more consequence than any of them first guessed. He made them smile, yes, but more critically, he saved a woman's name by the steadiness of his watch. That is what changed everything, the combination of an ordinary kindness and a man who would not let the story stop at accusation. If the story asks a moral question, it is this: who sits with the habit of proof before the habit of punishment? The house learned, slowly, to prefer the first. The city learned that headlines need patient hands to parse them. And Renata learned that surviving accusation is not a tidy triumph, but a life she must live with exquisite care. At the end of the day, the twins, older now, their smiles more ready and less rare, ran into the garden where light fell through the leaves and landed like small, kind truths. Noah stood on the path, not as a hero on a pedestal, but as a man who did his work and kept his files organized. Rafael watched and laughed with the easy warmth of a father who had learned to feel small wonder again.
Renata, sitting on a stone bench, watched them all and let the world be complicated and generous at once. If you were struck by this story, by questions of trust, the cost of assumption, and the slow work of justice, tell us in the comments what you'd do in Renata's place. Would you have waited for evidence or shouted your innocence into the press? Share your thoughts, and if stories like this matter to you, subscribe to follow more narratives that try, however imperfectly, to examine what justice looks like in the places we live.